Welcome to another past HSC exam question videos. In this video we're going to cover this exam question which comes from the 2001 paper and is question 26 of that paper and is worth 3 marks. What I'll do in a second is I read the actual question. Once I read the question, about 5 seconds to pause the video. Once you pause the video, attend the question and then press play when you're ready. Once you're ready, I'll go over the marking guidelines and a sample answer to show you how you could have answered that question to get full marks. The question itself says, when a body organ is transplanted from one person to another, the immune system of the recipient is triggered. A. Patients who have an organ transplant are given drugs to suppress their immune response. State the reason for this. And B. Explain a possible consequence for the general health of organ transplant patients as a result of suppressing the immune system. And that's worth 2 marks. So when you're ready, pause the video and attend the question. Welcome back. Alright, so for the first one, it's only worth 1 mark, and it says we need to state the reason. So you shouldn't have written too much. All you have to do is state a reason. And what the marking guideline says is outline the correct reason for why we suppress the immune response. So remember, if you've got an organ transplant, there is the immune response, which is more specifically the cytotoxic T cells. These cells can cause rejection because they can kill the actual organ transplant, right? So you have an organ transplant, there is the some parts of the immune response will be activated, which can kill the actual transplant tissue, and that's called rejection. So what these drugs do is simply they deactivate this part of the immune response, which means that this part won't happen, so there's no rejection. That's more or less what you should have written, but maybe just in 1 sentence or 2 sentences at most. Right, so what I wrote was, the drug suppresses parts of the immune system that would otherwise attack the transplanted tissue, right? By doing so, the transplanted organ is not rejected and will carry out its usual function. So here I've got the idea that we've got basically this immune response being suppressed, which means that the actual tissue is not rejected. That's it. That gets you 1 mark. And for the next one, so they explain the possible consequence for general health of the organ transplant. The actual marking guideline says we need to identify a possible consequence and also give appropriate reason or why that consequence has happened, right? So what is the consequence and why did it happen? So for example, you should have written that these drugs make the patient more susceptible to disease, which means they're more likely to have an infection in the future. And that gets you 1 mark, but remember you have to tie that to the actual what's happening and why this is happening. So the drugs deactivate the cytotoxic T cells, and that means that our immune response is weaker, and therefore we have a higher chance of infection. All right, so what I wrote is the drugs can make the patient more susceptible to future infections and disease. Again, it's worth 1 mark. And then the rest comes from here. The drug deactivates parts of the specific immune response, cytotoxic T cells, and not the T killer cells. I just wrote it in there to make sure that you don't confuse the two. These guys are not responsible for organ transplant rejection. It's actually the cytotoxic T cells. They're quite similar, but there's a bit of a difference, and these cytotoxic T cells are the ones that actually fight transplanted organs. Right, so remember that, because sometimes you need to know which exact T cell does it. To lower the chance of rejection. But these lymphocytes are no longer available to help fight off infections, right? So by deactivating them, which means we have more chance of infection happening in the future, because they help fight off infections. So if they're not there, more infections will happen. But it's basically a trade-off, and we think it's more worth that risk to give these people their organs, especially if they're really important organs. Alright, where did they come from? They came from those 2, actually mainly from this dot point. So outline the reasons for the suppression of the immune response in organ transplant patients. So this is what we were asked. Why do we do it? And obviously, if we need to know why we do it, we need to also we would also cover the risks of what happens if, for example, you lower the immune response. And that was the idea, that you have more infections. But hopefully that was useful.